right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bobby Zirkin, and proud to be working with the Maryland State Bar Association. I'm here today with my very good friend and a great state senator, Craig Zucker, from District 14 in Montgomery County. Among other things, he is on the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee, which is a really important one of the four standing committees of the state Senate, and a really important one for our state, and is newly appointed chairman of the capital budget subcommittee, which we'll talk about today, but deals with all of the capital projects or the building projects across the state of Maryland, from roads and bridges to YMCA buildings and the like, all across the state. So it's an incredibly good job. And Craig, welcome to Coffee and Conversations with Legislators in the State Bar.
Well, thank you, Bobby. It's good to be here. You know, when you said it was either playing you in basketball or showing up here, I thought this would be the easier route.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to have you here, and it's great to see you. So let's get started. You're here with the State Bar Association, representing 20 some odd thousand lawyers across the state of Maryland, and anxious to hear what you have to say. So I guess let's start by talking a little bit about who you are. Tell us, what do you do when you're not a state senator, how you got into politics, a little bit about your district and yourself. I'll open it up to who is Craig Zucker and how did you get into this mess of politics?
Well, sure. Well, it's become more of a mess as I get older, with especially with what's happening in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in New Jersey. My parents were both New Yorkers. My mother had, my mother jokes that one son is a lawyer because my brother, Seth Zucker, works in the state's attorney's office as a prosecutor, and the other son is a politician. And my brother comments and says, well, at least you got one of us right. So, but, I appreciate everything that you do. I see some of my constituents and friends around the line, like Gail Kahan and others. So I just wanted to, thank you all for hosting today. And so I came down, I joke that, my senior year of college, I missed the last exit on the turnpike and just kept coming down to DC, and eventually interned and got hired by then Senator Bill Bradley, Dollar Bill, used to play for the New York Knicks. Mm-hmm. Got me involved with politics, and then was working on Capitol Hill for a while. And I was provided an opportunity to get hired in the General Assembly. And my friend who had worked in Maryland politics said, is this something that interests you? And I said, no way. And they said, well, do you know a guy named Delegate Peter Franchot? I said, yeah, he's my delegate. And they said, would you ever consider working for him? And I said, no way in heck. And they said, well, I already scheduled an interview with you. And so I met Peter and I got hired. And that's sort of how I entered Maryland politics, was first working in the General Assembly as a staffer.
So you worked with Peter, and did you end up working with, and then he ran for controller. So tell me about the path that you took and he took, because I know you two have been together, kind of doing your thing, but also together. So when did all that diverge?
Yeah, so I worked with him in '99, and then about 6 months later, I was walking down the hallway with him, and I said, "Hey, Pete, I got a problem." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I feel like I've already hit my ceiling as your staffer." He says, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I think I could run for office one day. He's like, okay, well, finish up what you're doing here. So I finished up what I was doing there. And then Peter and I worked together to get a job in Albert Wynn's office. So I worked for Congressman Albert Wynn, eventually became his Montgomery County District Director, and then worked for a trade association. And then at that same time, when I was working for a trade association, Delegate Peter Franchot decided to run to become Comptroller Peter Franchot. So I worked it out where I took time off from that trade association to help Franchot win. And then after that, I became his deputy chief of staff, worked as his deputy chief of staff for 4 years, and then turned around and ran for the House of Delegates. And once I won a House of Delegates seat, the dynamics changed a little bit because I was no longer his deputy chief of staff and I became a special assistant, but I've been working peripherally and directly with his office, I guess, for the last 12 years or more.
Okay. And I will not ask you to comment on the gubernatorial race unless you want to, or unless we have a little time at the end. So sure. You ran and won for the House of Delegates in 2002 or 2000?
So I ran the first time in 2002, and before we went live, Bobby, you were joking about my beard, right? And I feel like it's more pronounced on screen, but when I first ran in 2002, I never realized how young I looked. I look pretty young now, but in 2002, I guess I looked really young. So I was a month out from the election. I'm door knocking in the same area where I live now, and gave this woman my quick platform, and she said, she had a real look on her face. I said, Craig, I said, is there something on your mind, ma'am? And she put her hand on my hand. She says, Craig, I'm so confused. Why do you have to knock on my door if you're running for student council? After that, I thought I knew I was going to lose. I just tried to make it competitive. So I ran 8 years after that and won, and made sure everyone knew how old I was at the time. But so I was elected in 2010 and was sworn in 2011.
2010. Okay. And now you are in the state Senate. And I guess before we start talking about substantive issues, I know you and I have chatted offline multiple times, and again today, I guess, how have you've been in politics actually since the time that I got involved? When I ran for the first time in 98, and that's when you and I met, 98, 99. Things have changed quite a bit down in the General Assembly, some for the better, some not for the better. So how would you describe how things are down there and how things have changed in the last 2 decades that you've been involved in this?
I think for the most part, and I'm sure you've seen it in keeping in touch with your colleagues, but for the most part, we've been able to keep sort of a firewall against the partisanship, the brutal partisanship in DC, where, in some ways they're not only putting party before people, but putting their own agenda before people. So I feel like in some ways we've continued to be able to work across party lines to deliver for Marylanders. And I think a lot of that is could be contributed to the fact that we're all Marylanders, we're all live in the same state, and that we're around each other a lot and have an opportunity to form personal relationships. But I think one of the things that I've seen that's changed is social media, and how social media has played into, I'd say, public service. So a lot of social media is focused on the politics, and when we now some of us might get attacked online, and I think in some ways it's good that advocates feel emboldened, but I also feel like, and this is something that I'm sure you went through, Bobby, when you were in elected office, is that sometimes we're not seen as people, we're seen as like a public building that can be yelled at or whatever. That's fine, we'll take it. But I think when it becomes more personal, and when you have people showing up at people's homes and protesting and stuff, it just takes it to another level. So I think social media has done a lot of good, but I also think it's created an opportunity for things to spread that might not be factual, but it's hard to contain. But ultimately, I feel like Annapolis is a shining light on a hill compared to where other states are and DC.
It's an interesting, it's actually would be a great topic of conversation with lots of legislators and advocates, quite frankly. When social media first came online, I said this is going to ruin the democracy, because it's a fact-free environment of people screaming, and its effect is great in politics. But that's a story for another day. So it's an interesting take, and something worth monitoring for people who care about public policy.
But Bobby, if I could just say one other thing, when I hear from my colleagues who are saying, hey, I'm getting, someone said this, or a group is saying this about me or, them on social media, I said, well, make some calls to your constituents, go door knocking, like get a baseline of like, if this is really what your constituents are thinking, or if it's just this group of advocates who are thinking this, and it doesn't reflect the overall concern or values of your constituents. It's challenging.
Definitely. When I first got in, we didn't have, there were no laptops on our desks. And so it's definitely a new environment. All right, let's get into, we've only got a few months until the next legislative session. Hopefully this year you won't be working in phone booths on the floor like you were last year. But tell us a little bit about, because this is, like I said, this is the Bar Association, so lawyers. Tell us a little bit about the Budget Committee. Somewhat foreign to, I would think, these practicing attorneys. Tell us about what is the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee? What is the jurisdiction of it, and you've been on that since you've been in office. Like, what is your role as a member of that committee?
Sure. Well, I think the budget committee is where the rubber hits the road, or at least it's providing the vehicles to hit the road, because it's not only the operating piece, so it's making sure that the state can operate, but also the bricks and mortar piece, the capital budget piece. So the budget and taxation committee that I serve on is both doing appropriations and revenue. So we're allocating money and we're also bringing in revenue to make sure that we can fund the state. So what the budget committee does is it looks through all the budget of the state of Maryland. What makes the governor of the state of Maryland unique at this moment, and it doesn't have to do with Hogan, it doesn't have to do with anything with party, but just based on the position of Maryland governor, is the governor of Maryland puts forth the budget, and the only thing the General Assembly can do at this point is cut. So what we do is we look through the budget. I mean, we can also allocate by fencing, and then it's up to the governor. But what we do is we look through every line item of the budget, and we look to see where there's spending that doesn't need to happen, where there might be redundancy in spending, and then we cut the money in order to balance our budget. So one of the differences between the state of Maryland and the federal government is really twofold. One is we have to, as the state of Maryland, balance our budget. It's part of the Constitution. The two things that we have to do in the General Assembly, so all the 1,000 bills that we sponsor, the only two that need to happen is balancing the budget and providing education funding. Those are the only two things that we must do. There's obviously other things that we feel like we have to do. So, we balance the budget, and unlike the other piece that I was going to say is, unlike the federal government, we can't print money. So we need to make sure it's balanced. Make sure that we're trying to decrease the spending over a certain amount of time. But this year I thought it was, and then we have the revenue piece. So any tax bill that comes in, or revenue bill, we look through, and we have different subcommittees with jurisdiction. And the subcommittee that I chair right now is the capital budget subcommittee, which you can appropriate. And that's the bricks and mortar. So your school construction, your local community projects. And
okay. And so the capital budget, which let's jump into that a little bit before we start talking about some specific issues. The capital budget, give us an idea of like kind of the size of this and the scope of what is funded out of all of these things. I would assume that kind of roads, schools, those are that's the vast majority of that capital budget. Is that an accurate assessment? And I guess as a second question, I'll turn it over just for a longer answer. How is it that all of these things make their way into the budget? If somebody has a project in, somewhere out in Deep Creek that they want funded, how did they end up in that capital budget?
And so the capital budget of the state of Maryland is sort of a moving target. It's decided by the Capital Debt Affordability Committee. It's this esoteric committee formed by legislators, the governor's officers, the comptroller, and the treasurer. So that establishes sort of what our spending guidelines are. Typically, it's about 1.1 billion with a B, and it's put forth first by the governor of the state of Maryland. So around the third week of January, around the same time that he puts forth his spending budget, his operating budget, the capital budget comes out. And what will happen is groups and legislators will ask the governor proactively to preemptively put money in the capital budget, so it's funded when it's already presented to the General Assembly. Often that doesn't happen because it's a finite amount of money. So if you have a legislator in Deep Creek, or if you have a legislator from Pikesville, what they have the opportunity to do is put in their own standalone legislation. It's called the local bond initiatives. And they are able to prioritize their community projects, non-for-profits, additions to schools when it comes to like bleachers, press athletic fields, or museums or places of art and history. Legislators can go ahead and request funding for that. And then it's basically then there's negotiation, and each legislator has to figure out what he or she can get. But there's a whole process through that. But legislators can request capital funding, and then it's up to the body to decide.
And roads and schools and things like additions to hospitals, state, the University of Maryland, or colleges and so forth, is that all done by legislators, or is that done by the agencies coming in and asking you all for those types of projects?
Both, really both, because what will happen is obviously, the hospitals, your higher education facilities are fantastic and they have a great advocacy shop. So they're talking to their experts and figuring out, okay, what do we need for this stadium? What do we need for this field? What do we need for this new higher ed facility that we're going to be putting on campus? And they'll put in a request to the governor. And the governor will most likely put in some amount of money in it, if it's a project. Then after that, they'll come to us, the legislators, and say, hey, we asked for 40 million, 40 million, and the governor only gave us 20 million. Can you all put in another 20 million toward it? So it really is a collaboration with the institutions and then us working off what the governor may or may not have done to appropriate money.
So final question on that. I assume that that's not an unlimited amount of money, right? So, if individuals are interested, so how is it that you make the determination, since the General Assembly can in fact appropriate their own capital dollars? How is it that you make the determination as to what you're going to appropriate in the capital budget versus, versus the overall budget, which has to be balanced?
So typically speaking, we have, it's roughly $1.1 billion. Sometimes we go above that. Sometimes we come into extra capital money, like we have federal legislation that's coming in that might put in another 100 million toward broadband or 175 million toward capital investments. And that offsets what we're going to do. So we may have an extra $100 million that we can allocate, or 175 million that we can allocate. And then there's also different bonds that we can use. So we try to go above and beyond what the governor allocates. And we also make sure that there's equity between the House and the Senate. But, look, every given year we have, $30 million that we can allocate toward local bond initiative. It's like your local funding with like $100 million worth of requests from legislators.
Wow. So that's quite a task of telling people no. It's got to be probably much more fun to tell people yes and go and see ribbon cuttings. But all right, and for those who are listening to this, this is an incredibly important job. One of the most important in state government, quite frankly, from the General Assembly standpoint, is the chair of this capital budget committee. Because so much money flows through that committee. So it's your first year, Doug Peters stepping down. So we wish you tremendous luck on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and Doug was great, and I was his vice chair for 2 to 3 years, and I've him not as long as you, Bobby, but I've known him for a long time, and he and I remain in touch, and he's been a good advisor throughout this. But
sounds good. Well, we're looking forward to watching you do this year. Let's move on to a substantive bill, which I know you were deeply involved in, and I know a lot of people have tremendous interest in, and that is sports betting.
Right.
Article the other day on it about the pace of it and who's going to get it and who gets in first and how much revenue is going to be generated by it, and is it going to be at Ravens Stadium? I know you're probably a Washington fan. I can't remember if you're with that horrible football team, but nonetheless, sports betting. Take us through kind of the process and your involvement in it and where we are at this point in time with that issue.
Sure. Well, just can I? One is. I just wish Justin Tucker had a Z at the end of his name, because he's making us all proud with make NFL history. But I was talking to Dick Cass about sports betting over the last session. Dick Cass is the president of the Baltimore Ravens, and we were talking, and I said, well, I'm at a little disadvantage because I'm a Baltimore Raven fan talking to you. He says, how are you a Baltimore fan if you live in the DC area? I said, well, you have to realize I grew up with a Jewish mother that never let me play football. So the only time I followed it is when I came down to Maryland and got into the Ravens when I worked in the General Assembly. But look, I think, it's we had seen a change in court decision that allows sports betting in the United States. And we saw that other states all around Maryland were going up with sports betting. So it's basically the sports betting is the opportunity to bet on sports, both at a physical location or online using a cell phone or some type of electronic device. So what we saw that other states around Maryland were doing it. So we put it on the ballot. and Marylanders overwhelmingly supported going up with sports betting. So we came up with legislation that we thought was fair and equitable, making sure that we were supporting small minority women-owned businesses in a comprehensive and meaningful way. And I'm hoping that it'll be up and running soon. You know, I was at a forum with other legislators, and the moderator asked me, you know, is Maryland the tortoise in the hair race? Because it seems like Maryland is behind everyone. I said, well, you know, I'm fine with Maryland being the tortoise, because from what I remember, the tortoise won at the end of the day.
Right.
So, I feel like, you know, we're getting there, but it's going to be a process. But I feel like ultimately we'll be able to generate anywhere between $17 to $20 million a year that would have been going to other states.
And so can you go through a little bit of the details of the bill for people that are interested, maybe attorneys who are working with groups that are interested in doing something? What does it look like? Obviously, people understand they can go to a casino and bet on these things and bet on sports gaming at some point in time, or perhaps they'd be able to go to the stadium and bet on them. But for somebody who owns a bar or a restaurant or something like that, what does it mean for them? How many licenses are going to be, and how does this whole process kind of take us through the details of this bill, if we could, a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So we had separated class. So we have licenses that are on hold, but you still have to apply, and you still have to be found eligible through license fees and making sure that you're meeting meaningful small minority women participation. But we had allowed for casinos, your sports complexes, some of your smaller off-track betting facilities, your electronic bingo halls that are more than 100 machines, to be able to be in line for a license, for a bricks and mortar license. And then we put a certain amount aside for those that want to apply, over 30 licenses for those Class B licenses. So that's a lower cost. So it's like $50,000 compared to $1 million or $250,000. And for the ones that are bigger, so for your casinos that have 1,000 or more video lottery terminals, they pay into a fund that helps support those Bs with training, getting off the ground. So it really provides, it's not unlimited licenses, but it really provides an opportunity for no pun intended, for people to have skin in the game. So if someone is interested in opening up, you know, a sports book and having a sports lounge, or if they want to have sports betting at their bar, they should just reach out to the Maryland State Department of Gaming and Lottery Control and start teeing that up. And then they'll go through a background check. And then there'll also be mobile licenses that everyone basically starts at the same time. And there'll be about 60 of those that once you have that license, anyone that has your application can bet through your mobile device anywhere in the state of Maryland. So we're hoping that it's going to be competitive, but we also hope that people will feel like they'll have opportunities that might have not had them before.
So is that an unlimited license amount? So if I have but if I have a restaurant, am I going to be able to have, you know, the opportunity to apply for a sports betting license, that somebody comes into my, you know, my burger joint and they're able to watch games, or is it a limited number of licenses that are going to be out there, and or is there a finite amount?
Yeah, so we have, for your bigger, so I'm just going to say your casinos, your professional sports teams, and then your racetracks, and then your off-track betting facilities. So those licenses are already sort of on hold.
Okay.
So you know, 16 Class A. So those are your bigger entities, and then you have your smaller Class B ones, which is off-track betting, this Maryland State Fair. Then you also have an additional that's not been claimed at all, 30 smaller licenses that are available to anyone that applies. It's really first come, first serve.
Okay.
You have 60 mobile licenses that have yet to be identified. We also have put in statute that after 3 years, we're going to revisit this and say, for instance, we have 30 spots for additional licenses. and say we have 40 entities interested, then after 3 years, we're going to revisit and see if we have to add more licenses.
Okay. And you think it's about 17 to $20 million per year in revenue?
That's what the assumption has been based on our independent, nonpartisan staff called Department of Legislative Services.
Okay.
I'm still optimistic that it could be more because I think people are really biting at the bit to do it. We've got such a great economy for it. We've got great sports teams for it. We've got Ravens, Orioles, the Washington football team in the area. And then also, one of the things that I'm not sure if we're really assuming is, so if you have people going into a casino who want to engage in sports betting, what prevents them from playing table games or video lottery terminals or other activities that could also generate money for the state?
Makes sense. All right. Well, much more to come on that this session. I assume, is there anything left to do, or is this is all just regulatory at this point in time and issuing licenses and so forth?
I mean, I feel like the Maryland General Assembly has done our part. Like, we've done everything that the people wanted in terms of just getting this thing passed. We've heard what the people wanted. We got it passed, and now as you pointed out, yes, it's really up to the regulatory piece, just making sure that. So there's the Gaming and Lottery Control Commission, and then there's also this independent body called SWORC, it's Sports Wagering Application Review Committee, and they've been appointed by both the House and the Senate, and then the governor's folks. So they're independent from us, and they're going to be reviewing this and making sure that it's fair and equitable. But at this point, it's up to that commission. It's up to the Maryland Gaming and Lottery Commission to get this up and going. We've done our part as legislators.
Well, it's going to be great to watch it come to fruition. It's interesting. There's two, and we're going to get to the second one too. I just want to get your thoughts. I know it's a little outside of budget and tax, but you all just finished doing sports betting, and now the new conversation is all the other states doing recreational cannabis or marijuana.
Right.
And I am curious about it. I know that is a multifaceted issue, it covers much more jurisdiction. We'll get to that in a second, but I do want to make sure we talk about something which I know is important to you, important to one of our former colleagues, Senator Congressman Raskin, and that's the 211 mental health services hotline. I think you guys called it the Thomas Bloom Raskin Act. Or can you talk through what is this about, the importance of this to you, and kind of how this all came about?
Sure. Well, I think for the people listening and watching this later, I feel like for me as a person, this past year and a half has fundamentally changed me as a elected official, as a father, just as a human being. And I felt like this session was different than any other session I've ever been involved in, because I remember heading into this past session. We were still in the pandemic, and I remember talking to the Senate president. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've got two small kids, and I was thinking, 20 years or 15 years, whether it's them or maybe even further down the line, their grandkids, if they realize what I was doing as a senator, I don't want them to come to me and say, Dad, what were you doing during this time? And I said, well, I changed the state soft drink from milk to chocolate milk. That, to me, I felt like this was our collective moment to do something for people. And I often feel like, and maybe this is just an elected official thing, but we get into this box, whether it's in DC or Annapolis, where we're just so tied into what we're doing at the moment that we sometimes lose sight of what people really need. So for this past session, for me, it was like just doing everything I possibly could, just doing good. If it didn't work, it didn't work, but just doing everything I could. And if you see something wrong, you try to improve it and fix it. So, our former colleague, Jamie Raskin, lost his son to suicide on New Year's Eve. And it fundamentally shook me. I mean, I'm home all the time. At that point, I was home all the time with my kids. I think, having lost my father 6 years ago, you understand how important and fragile life is and how meaningful it is to be there for your family and be there for your community. And so it really shook me and my wife when Jamie lost his son to suicide. And I remember waking up the next day and looking at my wife and said, we got to do something. Like, we have to do something. So she said, well, what about mental health parity? So let me check to see what's happening with that. So I gave Senator Malcolm Augustine, he's one of my colleagues from Prince George's County, a call, and gave another one of my colleagues, Delegate Bonnie Cullison from Montgomery County, a call. And we were just talking about mental health. And then I came up with the idea of what about if we did a mental health check-in program free for every Marylander, where we catch them before they're in crisis, because there's a lot of calls to the crisis hotline, but what about having mental health providers available for people before they're in crisis, or even when they're in crisis, but have a check-in program. So we created the first of its kind, it could be a national model for a mental health check-in program. We did not name it the Tommy Raskin Act, because I wanted it to have its own weight. I wanted it to be able to be able to be worthy of Tommy Raskin. And so I wanted to make sure there was no partisanship. I wanted to make sure that it was in good shape. And as soon as I knew that it was going to pass, I called Jamie and said, is this something that the family would want? And he said, yes. Yeah. So we changed the law to reflect Tommy Raskin's name. It's up and running. It's a statewide program. It was launched by the governor, the head of 211 Maryland, myself, Senator Augustine and Cullison, where people can either text 211 health check, or they can go online and register. And it provides free health service, mental health service to any Marylander that signs up. What happens is if you register within 24 hours, a live person calls you and says, well, what schedule works for you? And they would check in at that time, whether it's once every couple of days, once a week. And prior to its launch, I think there was over 200 people that are already pre-registered.
Wow.
So we really hope it's going to help to save lives. We do think it will, but we also think that it'll help people before they're in crisis. And it's just another tool that people know, look, we're all family here, whether we're related or not, we're all here for each other. And this was, I believe that this was a good public service. And I think it reflects what we're all about, and what we need to be doing in Annapolis is focusing on people and working together to solve problems.
That's an amazing story. And let me ask you this. So who are the mental health professionals that and is it run out of the Department of Health, or kind of what are the logistics of it? And so again, people would just text 211 or go online?
Yeah, so so it's run by 211. We put a hold on the budget. So we basically said if it needs additional money, the governor can appropriate more money. But right now they have mental health. They have basically resource centers, 5 statewide, that's run by 211. So it's entities throughout the state in every region. And what they've done is they've bulked up that staff. So if I were to call, if I were to register for 211, I would be connected to the Central Maryland site. If someone, you had mentioned, someone from Deep Creek about bond initiative. Well, if someone's calling from Deep Creek, that Western Maryland area, Allegheny or Garrett County, they would be hooked up with a resource out there, and it's mental health providers. They're trained in crisis resolution, suicide prevention. I mean, these are trained professionals who would be talking to Marylanders if they need it. Okay,
and you were the lead sponsor of this bill. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was the sponsor in the Senate. Saying graciously agreed to do it in the House, but Senator Augustine. I mean, one of the things that when you hear legislators speak, pay attention, because if anyone says they've done something unilaterally, they're the presiding officer, which is true, or they're lying, because nothing in Annapolis can be done alone. So Senator Augustine, it was everybody. I mean, it was totally bipartisan. I mean, Republicans on the committee were helping, saying this affects them. So it was just a real group effort, and everybody should take ownership and make sure they're getting it out to their constituents who they think might benefit.
Well, congratulations on that incredibly important piece of legislation. Kind of a lot of things got headlines. That was unfortunately one that got a few, but a really important piece of legislation. So congratulations on that success.
Thank you. And COVID also impacted, because it was the first bill the governor signed into law. But because of COVID, other legislators weren't able to be there. But I was just so happy that it was done. I didn't care who got credit as long as it was up and running.
All right, let's switch to something a little bit more, something that's going to happen this session, maybe. Lot of noise around the issue of recreational marijuana. Curious as to your thoughts but also from the budget. Again, like we've talked about already, over and over, you're on the budget committee. You're not the person who is, at least, in the committee room, talking about things like expungement or marijuana laws, or possession with intent to distribute, or any of those issues. That's the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which I think a lot of people who might listen to this are more familiar with. Let's talk a little bit about your thoughts about where we are with recreational marijuana, the impact on the budget. What do you think is going to happen this session, if anything?
I think something is going to happen this session, and it could be just a lot of talking this session. But my understanding is the House of Delegates most likely will put something forward, and then they'll, and then we'll have to kind of work through it as a Senate. I would say that if I were to, we handled a lot of stuff, and I don't mean to like punt, but like we did a lot of big stuff this past session, and we're heading into an election year. And I just think it's very important for us to like just stay focused on the ball and like what's most important to people. Let's make sure that we're continuing to focus on economic recovery. Let's get through redistricting. My sense would be, and again, this is just my sense, is that if I were to put a time frame on marijuana, recreational marijuana, I would be looking at a 2-year time frame, not next session. I could be totally wrong. I mean, I'm by no means, an expert, but I often heard Winston Churchill say the best politician is the one that can predict the next year, the next month, the next week, and the next day. And when nothing that came true like they predicted, they can explain why. So we'll see. But I think in the next couple of years will be when we'll pass something.
You think something will pass in the state at some point?
I think so.
So has the budget committee really taken a look at this in terms of its impact on state revenues, or is that really kind of a down the road conversation at this point in time? Or do you want to move on to the topic of conversation?
Yeah, I mean, right now I think it's just on a down the road conversation, because I think we would have to take a look at, I think on the revenue piece, what my sense is, and again, this is, you can listen, but I wouldn't quote me on this just because I don't know for certain, but my sense is that, if you have a big recreational marijuana legislation that's coming out, and there's a revenue piece, then we could be, so Bobby, when you talked about the committee of jurisdiction, you said judicial proceeding, judiciary, but if there's that fiscal piece, the budget committees will sometimes take a look at it. So my sense is that this will be referred, meaning that you'll have multiple committees being able to either vote on it or weigh in on it. And my sense is that the Budget and Taxation Committee on the revenue piece will be giving input and evaluating it at the appropriate time once we know what it is.
Makes sense. All right. Well, I'll let you off the hook on this one. Then we'll see. I mean, it's obviously a big, yet another big ticket issue for the General Assembly to wrestle with. It's somewhat akin to sports betting, although it's got much more, in some ways, much more effect, much more revenue, much more effect, and it impacts a lot of different jurisdictions. So it's obviously clearly quite complicated.
And I think and I think some of the thought around recreational marijuana has changed over the years, at least from what I'm hearing from my constituents, just in terms of them saying that they're okay with it or that they would want it. Obviously, there are details that that need to be worked out that some of my constituents, I don't want to say aren't thinking about, but it might not be as prevalent in their minds as it would be to legislators that are working through all the fine teeth of how to implement this. What's the enforcement mechanism? How do you prevent people from driving while impaired? Like just all these different things that would need to be worked out. Obviously, that's important to me. For me, it would also be what you originally started with, which just with my jurisdiction is just what kind of impact, positive or negative, would this have on the budget? How much revenue would it actually produce? And
it is an interesting. I just not to get editorial about it, but I just came back from a few weeks ago from Las Vegas, where it's legal. I was shocked. I was actually quite shocked at how prevalent it was just walking around the streets, and I was surprised at just how it was really everywhere. You couldn't really walk anywhere without getting some degree of smell or whatever of it. It was a little shocking just from being from here that you don't get that. So anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how this comes about. So we'll look forward to the budget committee's input and how it affects our state. I want to make sure that I know another topic of interest to you throughout your whole career, and you've been a champion on education. It's something we haven't talked. Again, these are issues that for lawyers aren't necessarily ones that we don't go into the courtroom to talk about the blueprint for education or educational excellence. But can you talk through kind of your role in that and where we are with the blueprint and what exactly that is? Because I would assume some number of people won't even know what it is I'm asking you right now. So can you talk a little bit about the budget committee, how it's enhanced our educational system, your role in it, and so forth? Kind of an open education system question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So I've sort of had two roles, because originally when I was at Brunson, I was on the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee. So I sort of had.
Was I?
I know, and I didn't have gray hair before that committee.
Mine went completely gray after that committee.
Exactly, but no, it was fine committee, great. It was just a lot of work, and so we were. As I said initially when we first started talking, I said the two things that the Maryland General Assembly has to do is pass a balanced budget and fund education. And what we've seen Maryland go from the top education system in the country to fifth, and it keeps falling. We also understood that you can't solve everything by just throwing money at it. That doesn't work. And you can't solve things by just throwing money at it without a revenue source and without hurting something else unless you've thought it through. So my colleagues and I thought it through, and Senator Pinsky and others were leaders in this, and Delegate Kaiser and others, and the presiding officers, of course. But and we came up with a framework based a little bit off of what Massachusetts has been doing. It was headed by a guy named Kerwin, who was the chancellor of the University of Maryland system. It was a nonpartisan commission that basically tried to work out what the best way to, education solutions. We needed to be competitive not only with other states, but other countries. And so we put forth legislation about $4 billion that provided career and job readiness, training teachers, more assistance with pre-K, more resources in the classroom. And what we did was we created a separate fund for it, the Blueprint Fund, which is different from our bank account. And we created a revenue source. So this wasn't like a settlement, like the tobacco settlement. This was a revenue source for loopholes that we saw that other states are already capitalized on. And we went ahead and funded this. And the irony is, so did the governor. And every budget the governor's done, he's funded it. It's been because of the lack of understanding around the blueprint, not from the people on this call, but just the public, that this is going to help create a better workforce, help make sure our kids are prepared. It's become very politicized. And I felt like it was after the governor's veto, because the Senate almost passed unanimously. It passed out of the Senate Budget Committee unanimously. And because everyone, had skin in the game, everybody felt like they had a voice, and we saw the path forward. But this past session, I was very pleased because, again, this isn't about partisanship, it's about public service. And we worked very closely with the governor on what was then became Blueprint 2.0. And this was really around COVID. Because the governor's veto, we lost a year. So working with the governor, we wanted to make sure that we bridge the digital divide and address the learning loss for students. So we put in hundreds of millions of dollars toward the Blueprint 2.0 to help with summer school, learning loss, just getting kids where they need to be. So I feel like on that end, we really worked in a bipartisan way to address kids' needs. But this is gonna put Maryland on the map. I believe that when the blueprint plan is already in effect or taking effect, and I feel like it'll be a national model for other states to follow.
So in the 2.0 version, is it when you talk about expansion of broadband? I mean, God, I was elected in '98, and I remember talking about the digital divide even all the way back then.
Right.
So does it seem like have we made really good, in the last 20 years, but also with this last legislation, are we there yet, or do we still have a long? Do we still have some steps to go in terms of bridging that digital divide? Because obviously, this pandemic has really laid bare some of the issues that and the haves and have-nots in terms of access to the internet and so forth and computers. And so are we there yet, or do we still have some steps?
No, we're not there yet, but I think we know where there is. So during the pandemic, what we saw was, and even in Montgomery County, where we saw children, students, not all of them were children, but students, didn't have access to digital technology, Chromebooks. So the school system as a whole, that's part of the money that we allocated, gave out digital equipment to students who didn't have access to it. And it gave them hotspots. So not only gave them the devices, but gave them the ability to connect on the internet. And I know in Montgomery County, they said, keep the Chromebooks. Prince George's County, they gave them 100,000 Chromebooks or something, or maybe 50,000 Chromebooks that they were able to hand out. So, but there's two moving pieces. There's not only bridging the digital divide for students, but the state Senate taking the lead along with the House of Delegates, working with the governor, agreement with governor, allocated $300 million to provide digital technology to over 500,000 Marylanders who weren't connected.
That's great.
And and we have more federal money coming in as well. So hopefully we'll get there. We know the roadmap, and I see the roadmap at a friendly destination. It's just a matter of how much time it's going to take, but we're getting there.
That's great. Another big accomplishment. I want to be mindful of time. We only have a few minutes left, and there are a number of things that I haven't gotten to. So rather than me continue to ask about some of these big ticket issues, let me turn it over to you. What do you have coming up in this? We got the next legislative session starts in the second week of January, and as it does every year, you've got 90 days before the election's coming up. I'm going to throw it out to you. Bills, election, redistricting, whatever it is you want to talk about. What is coming up in this next legislative session that we haven't talked about that perhaps we should be focusing on?
I mean, for me, it's around the capital budget, just getting a sense of how I can make sure that we're taking care of all the different parts of the state, figuring out where I can be helpful to my colleagues. One of the things before I was capital budget subcommittee chair, I gave up being chair of the education subcommittee, the budget subcommittee. And I have a deep interest in those children and individuals with special needs. And I realized that there is a program that it's called the Autism Waiver that provides wraparound services for kids and trains their parents. Well, there's an 8-year wait, and there's 6,000 kids waiting for services. By the time they become eligible, they've probably already aged out. So this past year, I found $4 million to get 100 kids from the waiting list into service. So one of my goals is to try to do as much good there as I can. What I do is I look at issues and say, okay, well, this person doesn't have a lobbyist. Well, now they do. And I become that advocate for those that might not have a big voice in Annapolis, but have an unbelievably important one.
That's fantastic. Anything else, like either in the budget committee or outside of the budget committee? Then I'm going to ask you an election question, and then
Okay.
And then we will wrap up. I'll ask you one more uncomfortable question that you will punt on, but let me just first say, is there anything else? Last year, obviously, huge issues that were got a lot of attention, particularly out of the my old committee, judicial proceedings. What are we, other than perhaps recreational marijuana, things about the capital budget? Is there anything else on the horizon that you see, or does this look like a calm legislative session to you?
I honestly think that that the best, so there are going to be things that we just know are going to be coming down the pike, right? So we know recreational marijuana redistricting is going to take up a lot of time. We're most likely going to a special session sometime in December to take care of the congressional redistricting, and then we're going to come back in January for a regular session to deal with our redistricting for us. I think the best way a legislator should proceed is look at what needs to be done and then do it. So for me personally, through the budget, I'm going to be taking a look at what Marylanders need heading out of hopefully what is the pandemic. Do they need boosters? Do we need to make sure that that's running effectively? Does the businesses need a booster shot? Does your small businesses need a booster shot in terms of both in the arm or in the economy? You know, where do we need to keep people having a lifeline to make sure that they can fulfill what they need and get through this? So for me, it's just going to be where do people need help and where things are, and then react toward that and make sure that we improve the lives of people.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to seeing what comes this session. Certainly a lot of big ticket issues again this year. Last question before I will let you go, wrap up and let you go. We have obviously elections all over the state of Maryland, redistricting, which is a big ticket issue in the General Assembly and for congressional districts, and a gubernatorial race. We've had 8 years of Governor Hogan, and so, you know, obviously he's term limited out. Lots of people running in both the Democratic and Republican sides. Where are you? What is the prediction? Are we going to see a Governor Zucker at some point in time this year, or are you staying out of it this year? Where do you handicap this thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting is, you know, I feel like a lot of elected officials are always looking at the next step and not thinking, well, what can I do in the current position I'm in? So there'll be no Governor Zucker anytime soon because there's still a lot left to do as a state senator. But I've endorsed Comptroller Peter Franchot, given at least the beginning of our conversation, the history. I feel like if the election were held tomorrow, Peter would win. But I think there's a lot of time between now and next year, next June, when the primary is. I think a lot of the candidates that we've heard are going to fade, and we'll have, you know, 2 to 3 candidates that are your top tier candidates, and then it'll be a brawl from there. But I think people have been inspired to go into public service, which is a good thing. I hope that whoever we choose as Marylanders, and I know we'll choose wisely, you know, we elect people who have experience in either elected office or government, because it is a tough job, but it is a very important job, and we just need good people.
All right. So we will we will take that for what it is, and we're looking forward to it. And Senator Zucker, let me just say, you know, on behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association, this has been interesting. You know, we often hear from the people who are doing things in the courtrooms, from the legislators that are legislating in criminal law or civil procedure, family law, and so forth. And I think it's really interesting and important for everybody to get a kind of a view of what else is going on down there in Annapolis. And as you said, that the 2 most important issues are the things you're involved in, which is passing a budget and constitutionally funding our education system, things that you're deeply involved in. So on behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association, thanks for taking an hour this morning with us, and thanks for everything you're doing in your public service. And have a great day. We look forward to seeing great things from you this session.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to see you all.
All right. And with that, thank you all for joining us again for Coffees and Conversations with legislators. Senator Zucker, thank you so much.